This study, called Restoring the Image, helps us understand the origin and essence of discipleship, following a thread through the Old Testament into the New as we discover this together. So work through the questions and verses in this first section called Origins, note any observations and notes, and then we will engage it together. And you can also check out the description below this video to read through the questions. Our first discovery question is, how did God make man and what were his responsibilities? Genesis 1:26-28. We find here that God made man in his image and likeness, and the responsibilities being that of dominion and to be fruitful and multiply, subdue the earth. So the next question that we have that we're going to discover is, how does the image of God relate to the glory of God? And we're looking here at Isaiah 43 verse 7 and Habakkuk 2 verse 14. And we find out that God created man for his glory and that the earth would be filled for his glory. So created for his glory in Isaiah 43:7, and then we find here in Habakkuk 2:14 that the earth would be filled with God's glory. And as we begin to ask that question, we find that man's role was to fill the earth with God's image. So we begin to find this connection between the glory of God and the image of God. The next set of questions being, what was the original temptation? What happened to the image of God in man? And what are the characteristics of God we were never meant to have? And here we're looking at Genesis 3 verse 5 and verse 22. We see here that the original temptation was to be like God in a way that we were not meant to. And so what happened to the image of God in man is that it was distorted, became a distorted image. So we find here that there are just characteristics or attributes of God that humans were never meant to possess, including things such as omnipotence or omnipresence, and ultimately the fact that only God was called to reign supreme over all of his creation. Man will participate in extending the reign and rule of God, but it is God's image and not man's that will be extended into the whole earth. So now we ask the question, what did Adam reproduce? And for this, we look in Genesis 5, verse 3. And as we examine this passage, it says that Adam began to create offspring in his own image. So Adam reproduced Adam's image. Now we ask the questions, what did man multiply, to what extent, and what did man fail to multiply? And for this, we look in Genesis 6, verse 13, where God is interacting with Noah. And here we find that violence has now multiplied over the whole earth. So it's everywhere is the extent to which it's gone. And we see that man has failed to multiply God's reign and rule, and his image has not been extended into the earth. So we finish out this section with one more question, and that is this: how much did God value man being in his image, even though flawed? So we look in Genesis 9, 6-7, as the result of this flood, and God again speaks to Noah and says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So back to the beginning mandate. But then he goes on and he says, whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. So we understand that he's very serious about this image being spread in the way that he designed it. So much so that it's a life for life kind of exchange. And this foreshadows his great love. He has so much love for us that he will take on our image, take on that situation, and redeem it, which we will find out in this next section. So take some time again to read through the questions and verses in this next section, make observations and notes, and then we'll go through it question by question together. So now we look at some questions in this next section as we examine Jesus, the perfect image, asking, how does Jesus define a disciple? We're going to look at Matthew 10, verses 24-25, and Luke 6, verse 40. We see here that ultimately Jesus calls his disciples to be like their teacher or like their master. In other words, to become a disciple, the ultimate target of success is the process of becoming like Jesus. Next question we ask is, how should a disciple look like? We're looking at several passages here, including Mark 1:17, John 14:20, Romans 8:29, Galatians 4:19, Ephesians 4 verses 13 and 5 verse 1, Philippians 2:5-7, and 1 John 2:6. We find the summation of all of these passages being two words, and that is like Jesus. A disciple should look like Jesus. And importantly, in Philippians 2, verses 5 through 7, we see that Jesus took on the form of a man, meaning that he made it possible for us to walk out being like and walking in the image of God in the form of Jesus. So now take a few more minutes and look over the questions and verses in this final section as we look at Christ and his church and make observations and notes before we go over these final questions together. So here we ask the question, what role does the church have in helping people become like Jesus? We're looking at Colossians 1, verses 15 to 18, 1 Corinthians 12, verses 12 and 27, and Ephesians 4, verses 11 to 13. So we find here that the church's job is to represent Jesus together and really to facilitate this process of discipleship until, as Ephesians 4 verse 13 says, that we reach the unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. A high call. When those outside the church look at me, do they get a good image of who Jesus is? It's incomplete, right? It's the body of Christ that is the better representation than the individual. The bride should be a crystal clear picture of who Jesus is and who we were meant to be. We grow into this image by practicing the things Jesus modeled and participating in the church. Becoming like Christ is like putting together a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. Where do you start? You don't start by trying to work on the puzzle. You start by doing what? Looking at the picture. And that's a great place for us to start too.